the stations, so-called, these days that go up bit by bit to the culmination of Easter, this Sunday, Sexagesima, is in St. Paul's outside the walls. These stations go back, remember, a very long time, and were already in place in the time of Gregory the Great, essentially. And therefore we have a reference in the collect to the Doctor of the Gentiles, and this first long reading on the life of St. Paul from his own pen. He was Doctor of the Nations, and about half the New Testament is from his pen, or that of his amanuensis, for it seems that he had a defect of the eyes. And therefore the Gospel comes well after that long reading, for it speaks of the power of the Word and the nature of its scattering in human hearts throughout the world. This week I came across again this passage which comes from our past here in Ireland. It's a testimony given by somebody who was moving around and wrote this down as he found it. There were no seats, and the population crowded into it in floods. He's talking about this sort of church. Each tide rising higher until the first comers were pushed forward against the altar rails, and so packed that they could not move a limb. All that could be seen of them was a moving mass of dark-haired heads, so close together that one could have walked across them without danger. From moment to moment, this mass moved and wavered. Long groans and deep sighs became audible. Some dried their eyes. Some beat their breasts. Every gesture of the preacher was understood on the instant, and the impression produced was not concealed. A cry of love or of grief answered each of his entreaties, each of his reproaches. This man who is actually observing this noticed an extra bit, and he puts it down. The spectators saw that it was a father speaking to his children, and that the children loved their father. Priests were precious, and so was their word. They came a long way to hear, and they wanted a clear message. Every month I celebrate for a cenacle in Athboy, or in the country nearby, and near there is a place where Father Barnwell was caught on his horse, going between one celebration and the other, presumably, pulled down by 4 strong men and immediately hanged because he was a priest. Therefore we understand the appreciation of these people in penal times for these sacred hands and this voice box which brought the word. I have been thinking quite a lot about both these issues. The hands of the priest, the sacred hands of the priest. I saw my confrère Frère Dominique the other day, and I remember how immediately after ordaining him a deacon, the Archbishop kissed Frère Dominique's hands. That is what they do in Italy a lot. The consecrated hands of the priest. Now, quite often people come to me from actually quite a long way away. They're traveling people and settled people, but they'll come for the priest's blessing, for they know that there is healing in the priest's blessing. And indeed, one sees that that is true. The sincere prayer of priest and people together does actually quite often produce an effect, even on the physical. For the Lord is present in the priesthood. Indeed, I remember when I was a student in Rome, immediately after ordination, the superior of the house, telling us one day in the morning mass, in the homily that he gave, because he was an experienced missionary. He's back now in Africa until he dies. He wants to die there. We priests, he said, don't know the power that we have in our hands. And he just told the story how a lady, desperate, came to him with her child, obviously on the brink and about to peter out. Not a single hope, especially without medicine, this poor child to survive. One last blessing. And the prior, just with one calm note, concluded, now that child is a strapping, healthy young man. I remember not long ago reading in some testimony of somebody who had gifts in the charismatic sense, and he was given unexpectedly to observe something during one prayer session. There was a priest praying with people, over people, and blessing them, and he was given to see by a divine intuition, but he saw that when the priest was blessing, there was, as it were, light and blood going from his hands into the head and into the person. Over these days, we will observe, in many churches in Ireland, both on this day, which would be St. Blaise's, the day after Candlemas, and shortly on Ash Wednesday, lay people presuming to bless, or the equivalent. It is better to be prudent and not say too much, but one has the intuition that most probably many of these blessings are completely ineffectual. It is not just a gesture which a priest makes. Indeed, in recent years, our Blessed Lady, it seems, at Medjugorje has insisted upon this. If you only knew the power of a priest's blessing. And she has added that she has not got it herself. Do you see how, from Sunday to Sunday, this element of, for instance, having all the children come up, and many of them being blessed, so-called, by lay people, is yet another ploy of the enemy of the soul, to deprive them of what is their right at that point. Do you know also that in the old rite which we are celebrating, every Holy Communion is preceded by a Eucharistic blessing? The sign of the cross is traced over the communicant by the priest first, and you know that Eucharistic blessing contains remission of all venial sin. Therefore, there is a very good preparation for Holy Communion when one receives in the old rite, especially when all favours the maximum use of grace at that moment, kneeling, waiting, not shuffling, but waiting until the Lord comes, opening one's tongue, one's mouth as a beggar, as a child to receive, not appropriating and pinching, as it were, its mind to take. By the way, Eucharistic ministers, so-called, nowadays take it themselves quite often. I mean, not only go to the tabernacle and take it, but communicate themselves. I have seen it, and it's happening quite a lot. But also, the very fact of kneeling, it's something which is bound to be pleasing to the Sacred Heart and to call upon greater grace. For the moment of coming into contact with the Most High is very well suggested by the physicity of the posture. And not to cop on to that is to show the shallowness quite often of one's interior life. There is some kind of false notion of equality around. One might, for instance, be called to celebrate in a charismatic group, and one finds that there are many trimmings of what is thought of as charismatic, but actually the charismata are no longer there, only the so-called side effects, gestuality, and yet those gestures are very confusing, for they sit quite often during the Eucharistic prayer. They will propose, if there are only a few of them there, that somebody will help as extraordinary minister, and so on. In other words, one wonders how authentic that kind of charismatic renewal is. But I wanted to speak for a few seconds on this question of the word, because also, in some countries more than others, lay people are being invited to come to the pulpit and take over the word. Not only the gospel, but also the homily. The word of a consecrated person from diaconate onward, who invokes the Holy Ghost before opening his mouth, is not his. He is ambassador. And that same Holy Spirit is able to put in his mouth and in the hearts of those listening, when there is order in what is going on, things are correct, grace. A person who is without genuine mandate from the church, standing in the place of deacon, priest or bishop, is by that very fact starting off on the wrong leg. How can one preach love and obedience when one is ipso facto disobeying and not loving? Because love is concrete, one obeys the will of the one that one is serving. Well, my friends, if you do what I command you. When I was a student, first time round in Aberystwyth doing classics in the mid-70s or early 70s, there was a great movement on Saturday evenings to listen to the preacher coming to town, because it was a very Protestant area, Aberystwyth. You'd find about 200 students spending all Saturday evening wanting a word, and great singing, of course. And I remember one talk that we had, amongst many, was on prayer. The preacher spoke, not for half an hour, not for 1 hour, not for an hour and a half, but for about 2 solid hours, and it seemed like half an hour. Why? He was interesting and he was on fire. It is not a question of length. One can be interesting and yet talk for a long time. One can be 5 minutes and reading a script and boring people to tears. The Lord spoke for whole hours on end, and people did not think of food, but he was interesting. He was the best teacher of all, parables. And that's what he's left us as the way to do it. When I was in Italy, I copped on very quickly that they will only listen if you're like them. And everything in Italy is technicolor, big time. So one has to find a means of getting through to them. And I remember we were handling people, for instance, on the 15th of August with a packed church, in boiling hot heat, the women there with their fans looking at you, half-baked, wondering what you're on about. So you have to find some means of getting their attention, and only then will they pick up their ears. Anything to make sure they're listening, because it's far more important almost that they're with you than that you're saying the best possible truths in the world if no one is listening. But they'll take something away if it's visible, just the modern means of the parable. E.g., one amongst millions, when it was the question of the gospel of that poor rich man who was thinking he'd got it all done for himself. Aren't I great? Of big granaries to put all my grain. And so, what one would do, take a balloon and paint a big face on it, and blow up on it, and say, yes, you're getting bigger, you're getting more full, you're getting more complete, yes, bigger still, and boom! With a big pin, wake up even the most dormant people present. But at least they would have got something. But it's true, the Lord knew exactly how to get the attention of the people, and old methods still function. I remember when I was with my Benedictine friends growing up there, we had one very good preacher. In fact, they would preach every day, twice a day, the conventual mass and an evening one. And I would like sometimes, even if I'd been at the 8 o'clock one, to stay on just for the beginning of the 9 o'clock one, or 9:15. Why? Because of the sermon, even on a weekday. And this particular one, Dom Kevin, Benedictine of Ampleforth, he would do it like this. He would take anything from daily life and put it in such a way that a message would remain for the rest of your life. E.g., one day he came up with this. This morning, my brethren, I was going down to the dock area, and what did I find? I saw these gigantic cylinders, yes, these huge gas things, they go up and down, up and down. So I decided, wouldn't it be wonderful? I decided to sit on the top of one of these huge gas cylinders and sing up and down, up and down. Why? Because when we're on the top, we have the global vision of things, the long view of things. And he was reminding us how we can be so absorbed with the tiny things of life that we forget what life is about. He would preach on the Colgate ring of confidence. Anything he would find, he would preach on it. And you'll never ever forget a sermon which is based on something daily. I just want to finish, my friends, with one thing. It's this. When we are listening to the Word is potentially changing us. But it demands what? That we switch off to all other words. Listening is a whole art, and one can't be taking in two things at the same time. The other is this, going back to what I mentioned, the sacrality of what we're doing. This is where we've come from. This was going back to the time precisely when that testimony was given. The people were aware that when we're at the altar, we're at Calvary. It's not something human. Hence it is that when I was sent immediately after ordination to Fontainebleau to be taught how to celebrate the old rite and also to give a retreat there, I remember how it hit me, being exposed to something hugely powerful, a massive Benedictine community in the old rite, where it hit you between the eyes. This is not something human. All we do here is bow our head and cease to exist.